Margaret Chen quietly folded the last towel and placed it in the perfectly organized linen closet. 3 years of working in this massive Beverly Hills mansion had taught her exactly how everything should be arranged. Not a single item was ever out of place when she finished her work. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 in the morning. Margaret had been awake since 4:30, just like every other day. She believed in starting early and finishing strong. The billionaire who owned this house, Robert Harrison, would wake up in exactly 1 hour and expect his coffee to be ready, his newspapers arranged on the breakfast table, and his gym clothes laid out upstairs. Margaret was 45 years old, but she moved through the house with the energy of someone much younger. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the same style of simple uniform every day. She never complained, never asked for time off, and never seemed stressed about anything. Robert had been through 12 housekeepers before Margaret arrived. Some quit because the work was too demanding. Others were fired because they couldn't meet his high standards. A few had tried to sell stories about his private life to gossip magazines, but Margaret was different from all of them. She had applied for the job 3 years ago with a simple resume. It listed her previous work experience as cleaning services for various wealthy families. Her references were solid. Her background. Check came back clean, and during the interview she spoke softly but confidently about her work ethic. What impressed Robert the most was how calm she remained during the interview. His phone had rung 6 times, his assistant had interrupted twice with urgent messages, and his dog had knocked over a glass of water. Through it all, Margaret sat quietly with her hands folded, waiting patiently for him to finish each interruption. From her very first day, Margaret seemed to understand the house better than people who had lived there for years. She knew which floors creaked, which doors stuck, and which rooms had the best natural light at different times of day. She learned Robert's routine within a week and anticipated his needs before he even knew what they were. The mansion had 23 rooms spread across 3 floors. Most housekeepers found it overwhelming, but Margaret moved through it like she had lived there her whole life. She created her own system for cleaning each room efficiently, and she never seemed to get lost or confused about where things belonged. Robert's friends often commented on how professional and discreet Margaret was. During dinner parties, she moved around the house like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates without anyone really noticing her presence. She never lingered to listen to conversations, never asked personal questions, and never gossiped with other staff members. But there were small things about Margaret that Robert began to notice over time. Things that seemed unusual for a housekeeper. She had an incredible memory for details. If Robert mentioned that he was running low on his favorite coffee, Margaret would have already ordered more before he remembered to ask her. If a guest left something behind after a party, Margaret always knew exactly where to find it and who it belonged to. She also had an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings. Robert had tested this accidentally a few times. Once, he had been walking quietly down the hallway in his socks, trying not to wake anyone early in the morning. But Margaret had called out softly from the kitchen, asking if he needed his coffee, earlier than usual. She had somehow heard him moving around even though he thought he was being completely silent. Another time, a delivery man had come to the wrong entrance at the back of the house. Before Robert or his security team even knew someone was there, Margaret had already gone to meet the delivery man and redirect him to the proper entrance. When Robert asked how she knew someone was there, she simply said she had heard a car, Dr. Close. Margaret also seemed to understand security better than most people. She never left doors unlocked, always double-checked windows before leaving a room, and had an intuitive sense of which visitors belonged in the house and which ones seemed out of place. Robert's head of security, Tom Bradley, had mentioned several times how impressed he was with Margaret's awareness. Most household staff needed constant reminders about basic security protocols, but Margaret seemed to follow them naturally. She never propped doors open while cleaning, never left valuable items sitting around, and always made sure exterior doors were secured when she finished working in any area. The most remarkable thing about Margaret was how she handled stressful situations. Robert's business dealings often created chaos in the house. There were emergency phone calls at all hours, unexpected visits from lawyers and executives, and days when the entire house felt like a pressure cooker. During one particularly intense week, Robert had been dealing with a hostile takeover attempt of one of his companies. His phone never stopped ringing, he barely slept, and his mood was terrible. Most of the staff were walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do anything that might set him off. But Margaret continued her work exactly as she always did. She brought him his coffee at the same time every morning, kept his meals ready when he finally had time to eat, and maintained the house perfectly despite all the chaos around her. She never seemed rattled by the yelling, the late-night meetings, or the constant stream of visitors. Robert found himself watching Margaret more carefully during that stressful week. While everyone else in the house seemed affected by the tension, she remained completely composed. It was almost as if she had experience dealing with high-pressure situations before. One morning, while Robert was on a particularly difficult conference call with his lawyers, he noticed Margaret cleaning the office next to his study. The conversation was heated, with voices being raised and threats being made. But Margaret continued dusting the bookshelves with the same calm focus she always showed, apparently unbothered by the drama happening just a few feet away. Most people would have been curious about such an intense conversation, or at least distracted by it. But Margaret seemed to have the ability to focus completely on her work regardless of what was happening around her. It was a skill that Robert had only seen in people who had training in high-stress professions. Margaret's references had all praised her reliability and discretion, but none of them had mentioned anything about her having such remarkable composure under pressure. Robert began to wonder if there was more to his housekeeper's background than her simple resume suggested. But whenever he tried to ask Margaret personal questions, she politely redirected the conversation back to work topics. She never shared details about her life before working for him, never mentioned family or friends, and never talked about her plans for the future. Robert respected her privacy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Chen was far more than she appeared to be. Little did he know that his quiet, unassuming housekeeper was about to prove just how extraordinary she really was. The first robbery happened on a Tuesday morning in September. Margaret was dusting the living room when she heard Robert shouting into his phone. His neighbor, Mrs. Williams, had returned from her yoga class to find her house completely ransacked. The thieves had taken her jewelry collection, several expensive paintings, and even her husband's vintage watch collection from their bedroom safe. What shocked everyone was how professional the job appeared to be. The security system had been disabled without triggering any alarms. The thieves knew exactly where to look for the most valuable items. They had even avoided the fake jewelry that Mrs. Williams kept in an obvious jewelry box, going straight for the real pieces hidden in a secret compartment. Robert immediately called his security company to upgrade his own system. He installed additional cameras around the property and hired 2 extra security guards for nighttime patrols. Margaret watched all of this happening while she continued her daily work, but something about the robbery bothered her in a way she couldn't quite explain. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the victim was Mr. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down from Robert. The thieves had struck while he was at his weekly poker game, which he attended every Thursday night without fail. They had taken his art collection, his wife's, designer handbags, and cash from a safe that very few people knew existed. Margaret was serving coffee to Robert and his business partner when the news came in. She noticed how Mr. Peterson kept mentioning that the thieves seemed to know his exact schedule. They had even known that his housekeeper took Thursdays off and that his wife was visiting her sister in San Francisco. The third robbery happened in October, and this one really caught Margaret's attention. The victims were the Chen family. No relation to Margaret despite sharing the same last name. Mr. Chen was a successful real estate developer who lived in the biggest house on the street. The thieves had broken in during his daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner when the entire family was at a restaurant across town. But here's what made Margaret start paying close attention. The thieves had known about a hidden safe behind a painting in Mr. Chen's study. They had also known which nights the family's expensive cars would be in the garage versus parked outside. Most importantly, they had known that the family's German Shepherd would be staying at the vet overnight for a routine procedure. Margaret realized that whoever was behind these robberies wasn't just randomly targeting rich houses. They had detailed information about each family's routines, security systems, and valuable possessions. This level of planning meant someone was watching these families closely or had access to very personal information. Robert's stress levels went through the roof after the third robbery. He started changing his routines randomly, never leaving the house at the same time twice in a row. He had his security team sweep the house for listening devices. He even started having his phone calls in different rooms each day, worried that someone might be monitoring his conversations. Margaret watched Robert's increasing paranoia with concern, but she also started paying attention to things that others were missing. During her 3 years in the house, she had developed an excellent understanding of the neighborhood's rhythms. She knew which families traveled frequently, which ones had predictable schedules, and which ones talked openly about their valuable possessions. The fourth robbery happened in November, right before Thanksgiving. The victims were the Rodriguez family, who lived at the end of the street. Margaret had cleaned their house once when they needed extra help for a large dinner party. She remembered that they had beautiful antique furniture and an impressive wine collection in their basement. The thieves had struck while the family was at their annual Thanksgiving dinner at Mrs. Rodriguez's mother's house, a tradition they had maintained for 15 years. Once again, the robbery showed intimate knowledge of the family's schedule and the location of their most valuable items. Margaret started making mental notes of everything she observed. She remembered conversations she had overheard during Robert's dinner parties, phone calls that had happened while she was cleaning nearby rooms, and casual comments that guests had made about their travel plans or new purchases. During one of Robert's dinner parties in early December, Margaret was refilling water glasses when she heard something that made her pause. Mrs. Williams, the first robbery victim, was talking about how she had mentioned her yoga schedule to someone just days before the break-in. She couldn't remember exactly who she had told, but she was certain she had discussed her Tuesday morning routine with someone new. Margaret continued serving dinner, but her mind was racing. She started thinking about all the social gatherings that had happened at Robert's house over the past few months. There had been dinner parties, charity fundraisers, business meetings, and casual get-togethers. People from all over the neighborhood had been in and out of the house. The fifth robbery happened 2 days before Christmas. This time, the victims were the Thompson family, who lived directly across the street from Robert. Margaret watched from the upstairs window as police cars filled their driveway and investigators went in and out of the house. Mr. Thompson came over to talk to Robert that evening. Margaret was cleaning the kitchen, but could hear their conversation clearly. The thieves had known that the family always spent Christmas Eve at their cabin in Lake Tahoe. They had known about a safe hidden behind a bookshelf in the master bedroom. They had even known that the family's security cameras would be turned off because they were having electrical work done that week. Margaret realized that this wasn't just about someone watching the neighborhood. The level of detailed information suggested that someone was systematically gathering intelligence from multiple sources. But how? She started thinking like she used to think 15 years ago, before she had decided to leave her old life behind. She mentally reviewed every person who had access to these families' personal information: housekeepers, gardeners, security, companies, contractors, delivery drivers. Any of these people could potentially gather information about schedules and valuables. But Margaret suspected it was something more sophisticated than a single inside person. The robberies were too well coordinated and showed knowledge that would be difficult for any one person to gather alone. The breakthrough in her thinking came during Robert's New Year's Eve party. Margaret was supervising the catering staff when she noticed something odd. One of the servers seemed more interested in the conversations happening around him than in actually serving food. She watched him carefully throughout the evening and noticed that he positioned himself near groups of guests who were discussing their upcoming travel plans and recent expensive purchases. Margaret's old instincts were telling her that something wasn't right about this server. He moved differently than the others, asked subtle questions that seemed innocent but were actually quite specific, and had an almost perfect memory for details that guests mentioned casually. When the party ended, and the catering staff was cleaning up, Margaret made note of the company they worked for and the name on the server's uniform. She didn't say anything to Robert that night, but she had a feeling that she was finally starting to understand how these robberies were really happening. The pattern was becoming clear to someone who knew how to look for it. But Margaret also knew that having suspicions and proving them were two very different things. She would need to be very careful about her next steps, because if she was right about what was happening, the people behind these robberies were far more dangerous and organized than anyone realized. Margaret spent the weeks after New Year's quietly investigating the catering company that had worked Robert's party. She called them pretending to be interested in hiring them for her own fictional event. The company, called Elite Events Catering, had an impressive client list that included many of the wealthiest families in Beverly Hills. What made Margaret's blood run cold was realizing that Elite Events had catered parties for every single family that had been robbed. Mrs. Williams had used them for her anniversary party in August. The Peterson family had hired them for their summer barbecue. The Chen family had used them for their daughter's engagement party. Every victim had one thing in common. They had all trusted this catering company with access to their homes. Margaret knew she needed proof before making any accusations. She started paying closer attention to every detail when Robert announced. He was planning his annual charity gala for March. As expected, he hired Elite Events to handle the catering for the 200-person event. The night of the gala finally arrived. Margaret had been preparing for weeks, not just to supervise the household staff, but to watch every move the catering team made. She had positioned herself strategically throughout the evening to observe their behavior without drawing attention. Tapitas. Party was in full swing by 8 o'clock. Robert's mansion was filled with the city's wealthiest residents, all dressed in expensive gowns and tailored suits. The champagne was flowing, the orchestra was playing, and everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. But Margaret was working. She had memorized the faces and names of every legitimate staff member from Elite Events. The company had sent 12 servers, 4 bartenders, 3 kitchen assistants, and a manager. Margaret had studied their employee list carefully and knew exactly who should be working the event. About an hour into the party, Margaret noticed something that made her heart race. There was an extra server moving through the crowd, someone who wasn't on the official staff list. She had memorized. He was tall, wearing the same uniform as the other servers, and carrying the same type of serving tray. To anyone else, he would have looked like just another member of the catering team, but Margaret's trained eye caught the differences. His uniform was slightly newer than the others, and his name tag looked like it had been recently printed. More importantly, he moved differently. While the real servers focused on refilling glasses and clearing plates, this man was positioning himself near conversations and listening intently to what the guests were saying. Margaret began following him. Discreetly, she watched as he approached a group of women discussing their upcoming trip to Europe. He lingered nearby, pretending to adjust items on a nearby table while clearly listening to their conversation about leaving town for 3 weeks. When they mentioned how much they would miss their weekly bridge game, he took even longer to finish his supposed task. Next, she observed him near a group of men talking about their recent art purchases. One man was bragging about a new painting he had. bought for his home office, describing exactly where he had hung it and how much it was worth. The fake server asked if anyone needed a drink refill, giving him a reason to stay close to the conversation longer. Margaret realized she was watching something far more sophisticated than a simple inside informant. This was an organized intelligence gathering operation. The fake server wasn't just casually overhearing conversations. He was systematically targeting specific types of information. She decided to test her theory. Margaret approached the suspicious server and politely asked if he needed any help finding anything in the kitchen. She wanted to see how he would respond to a direct question from someone who clearly worked in the house. His reaction confirmed her suspicions. Instead of responding like a normal catering employee would, he seemed nervous and gave her a vague answer about everything being fine. A real server would have been friendly and might have asked about where to find certain supplies or how to navigate the house layout. This man clearly wanted to avoid any conversation that might reveal he didn't actually work for the catering company. Margaret continued watching him throughout the evening. She noticed that he had a small device clipped to his belt that looked like a standard radio used by catering staff to communicate with each other. But when she got a closer look, she realized it was actually a sophisticated recording device. The man was literally recording the conversations he was overhearing. Around 10 o'clock, Margaret made another disturbing discovery. She spotted a second fake server near the bar area. This one was a woman, also wearing a uniform that looked slightly different from the official elite event staff. She was asking guests casual questions about their homes and schedules while serving drinks. Margaret watched as the woman approached Mrs. Davidson, an elderly guest who lived alone in a mansion about 2 miles away. The fake server complimented Mrs. Davidson's beautiful bracelet and asked if she had other jewelry pieces at home. Mrs. Davidson, flattered by the attention, began describing her late husband's gift of a matching necklace and earrings that she kept in her bedroom safe. The woman listened carefully while pretending to clean glasses behind the bar. She asked innocent-sounding follow-up questions about whether Mrs. Davidson felt safe living alone and if she had good security at her house. Mrs. Davidson, happy to have someone to talk to, shared details about her security system and her habit of turning it off during the day because she found the beeping sounds annoying. Margaret felt sick to her stomach as she realized what she was witnessing. These people weren't just gathering random information, they were conducting detailed intelligence, interviews with potential robbery victims, and they were doing it right in the middle of a crowded party where no one suspected anything. She began moving through the party more systematically, trying to identify how many fake staff members were actually present. Over the next hour, she spotted at least 4 people who didn't belong to the legitimate catering crew. They were scattered throughout the house, each focusing on different groups of guests and gathering different types of information. One fake server was near the library, where several men were discussing their business travel schedules for the coming months. Another was in the garden area, where a group of women were talking about their children's boarding school schedules and when their houses would be empty. A third was near the entrance, observing who arrived together and seemed to be making mental notes about which couples lived in the same house. Margaret realized that this wasn't just about robbing houses. This was about robbing specific houses, at specific times when they would be empty and vulnerable. The fake staff members were creating detailed profiles of each potential target, including their schedules, security measures, valuable possessions, and family situations. The most chilling discovery came when Margaret noticed that some of the fake servers were taking photos. They had small cameras disguised as buttons on their uniforms and were photographing valuable jewelry, watches, and other items that guests were wearing. They were essentially creating a catalog of items to steal. Margaret knew she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple burglary ring. This was a sophisticated criminal organization that had infiltrated one of the city's most trusted catering companies. They had access to the homes of the wealthiest families in Beverly Hills, and they were using that access to plan crimes with military precision. As the evening continued, Margaret faced the most important decision of her life since retiring from police work. She could call the authorities immediately and risk causing panic that might allow the operation's leaders to escape. Or she could stay quiet and try to gather more evidence, knowing that doing so might put more innocent families at risk. Margaret chose a third option. She would use skills she had hoped never to need again. Margaret made her choice in that moment. She wouldn't just call the police and hope for the best. She was going to stop this operation herself, using every skill she had learned during 15 years as a detective. But she had to be smart about it. One wrong move and the criminals would disappear, only to set up shop somewhere else and continue their crimes. First, she needed to understand their complete plan for tonight. Margaret had already figured out that they were gathering intelligence, but she suspected there was more happening. Criminal organizations this sophisticated didn't just collect information at parties. They used it immediately when they had the best opportunities. Margaret began moving through the house with a new purpose. To anyone watching, she looked like she was simply doing her job, supervising the catering staff and making sure everything ran smoothly. But she was actually conducting a counter-surveillance operation, watching the watchers without them knowing it. She started by studying the timing of everything. The fake servers had arrived mixed in with the real catering staff at 6 o'clock. They had spent the first hour observing and getting familiar with the house layout. Now they were in the intelligence gathering phase, systematically working through different groups of guests. Margaret noticed that each fake server had a specific role. One focused on gathering information about travel schedules and when houses would be empty. Another concentrated on learning about security systems and daily routines. A third was identifying valuable items and where they were kept. The fourth seemed to be mapping out the social connections between families, figuring out which neighbors knew each other's schedules. But Margaret realized something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't just about planning future robberies. The criminals were preparing to strike tonight, while all these wealthy families were gathered in one place, away from their homes. She confirmed her suspicion when she overheard one of the fake servers speaking quietly into his radio device. He wasn't communicating with other catering staff. He was reporting to someone outside the house. Margaret managed to get close enough to hear him say, "Phase 1 complete. All targets confirmed at location. Teams can proceed." Margaret's mind raced as she understood what was happening. While the wealthy elite of Beverly Hills were enjoying Robert's charity gala, criminal teams were preparing to simultaneously rob their empty houses. The fake servers weren't just gathering information for future crimes. They were coordinating live robberies happening right now. She had to act fast, but she also had to be careful. If she caused a panic at the party, the fake servers would alert their teams, and the robberies would be called off. The criminals would escape, and they would simply try again another time with better security measures. Margaret decided to use the house's sophisticated security system against the criminals. Robert had installed cameras and communication equipment throughout the mansion, and Margaret knew how to operate all of it. She had been watching Robert use the system for 3 years and had even helped the security technicians during installations. She made her way to Robert's home office, where the main security controls were located. The room was empty because Robert was busy hosting the party downstairs. Margaret quickly accessed the camera system and began reviewing the recordings from earlier in the evening. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The fake servers had been photographing and recording much more than just guest conversations. They had been documenting the locations of security cameras, noting which rooms had valuable items, and even recording the sounds of Robert entering, his security codes when he had briefly checked the system earlier. Margaret realized that Robert's house was also being targeted for robbery tonight. The criminals weren't just planning to rob the guests' houses. They were planning to rob the host's house, too, probably assuming that Robert would be too busy with his party to notice anything unusual. She began her counter-operation by using the internal communication system that connected all the security cameras and intercoms throughout the house. Margaret started subtly adjusting camera angles to better capture the fake server's activities. She activated recording devices in areas where she had seen them gathering intelligence. Next, Margaret began manipulating the party environment to disrupt the criminals' timeline. She quietly instructed the real catering staff to begin serving the main course 30 minutes earlier than planned. This forced the fake servers to either break character by not helping with food service or to abandon their intelligence gathering to maintain their cover. She also began strategically positioning herself and other household staff in key locations throughout the house. Margaret told the security guards that she had noticed some unusual activity and asked them to pay closer attention to the catering staff. She didn't reveal what she had discovered, but she gave them enough concern to increase their vigilance. Margaret's most clever move involved the house's lighting and climate control systems. She began making subtle adjustments that would make it harder for the fake servers to move around unnoticed. She increased the lighting in hallways and dimmed lights in rooms where guests were gathered, making it more obvious when someone was lurking in areas where they shouldn't be. She also started using the intercom system to make strategic announcements. Margaret announced that the kitchen needed more ice from the storage room in the basement, forcing legitimate catering staff to move through areas where fake servers were operating. This created more witnesses and made it harder for the criminals to operate freely. Throughout all of this, Margaret maintained her calm, professional demeanor. She continued to smile politely at guests, supervise the catering staff, and handle the normal duties of managing a large event. No one at the party had any idea that their quiet housekeeper was conducting a sophisticated counterintelligence operation right under their noses. Margaret's years of experience had taught her that the best operations were the ones where nobody realized anything unusual was happening. She was using the criminals' own tactics against them, hiding in plain sight while gathering evidence and disrupting their plans. Around 11 o'clock, Margaret made a crucial discovery. She overheard one of the fake servers receiving new instructions through his radio device. The robbery teams had encountered unexpected problems at several target houses. Some security systems were more advanced than expected, and some houses had unexpected occupants. Margaret realized that her countermeasures were working. By changing the party timeline and increasing security awareness, she had created enough disruption to interfere with the criminals' carefully planned operation, but she also knew that desperate criminals were dangerous criminals. If their original plan was falling apart, they might try something more risky, like attempting to rob houses with people still inside, or even targeting the party guests directly. Margaret faced another critical decision. She had successfully disrupted their operation, but now she needed to make sure the criminals were actually caught, rather than just scared away. She needed backup, but she couldn't risk alerting the fake servers that their cover had been blown. She decided to take the biggest risk of her life since leaving police work. Margaret was going to contact her former colleagues and coordinate a law enforcement response that would catch the entire criminal organization in the act, but she would have to do it without anyone at the party knowing what was happening, including Robert. Margaret looked around the elegant party one more time. In a few minutes, this peaceful evening was going to become something very different. She just hoped that when it was all over, everyone would understand why she had made the choices. She did. At exactly 10:30 p.m., Margaret made a move that would change everything. She quietly slipped into Robert's study and pulled out her personal phone. After 3 years of keeping her past buried, she was about to make a call that would bring it all back to the surface. She dialed a number she knew by heart, even though she hadn't used it in years. Detective Luis Morales had been her partner for 7 years before she retired. If anyone would believe her story and act quickly, it was Luis. "Luis, it's Margaret," she whispered into the phone. "I need your help, and I need it now." There was a pause on the other end. Luis had been shocked when Margaret suddenly retired, after the shooting incident that left her with a permanent injury to her left shoulder. He had tried many times to convince her to come back to the force, but she had always refused. "Margaret, where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I'm in the middle of something big. I'm at 1247 Sunset Boulevard in Beverly Hills. There's a criminal organization operating here tonight, and they're about to rob multiple houses simultaneously. I need backup, but it has to be coordinated perfectly. Margaret quickly explained what she had discovered, giving Luis all the details about the fake catering staff, the intelligence gathering, and the real-time robberies happening across the neighborhood. She provided addresses of all the houses that had been targeted and descriptions of the fake servers still operating at the party. Luis didn't question her story for a second. He had worked with Margaret long enough to know that when she said something was happening, it was definitely happening. Within minutes, he had coordinated with multiple police units to surround both the mansion and the targeted houses throughout Beverly Hills. Margaret's plan was working perfectly. The police would arrive simultaneously at all locations, catching the criminal teams in the act while they were spread out and vulnerable. But first, she had to make sure the fake servers at the party didn't have a chance to warn their colleagues. She returned to the party and began the most dangerous part of her plan. Margaret started approaching each fake server individually, using her knowledge of their positions and activities to isolate them from each other. The first fake server was near the garden area, still gathering information from guests about their travel plans. Margaret approached him with a smile and told him that there was an urgent phone call for him in the kitchen. When he followed her away from the guests, she led him directly to where Tom Bradley, Robert's head of security, was waiting. "Tom, this man doesn't work for the catering company," Margaret said calmly. "He's been recording guest conversations all evening. I think you should call the police." The fake server tried to run, but Tom was a former military officer who knew how to handle difficult situations. Within seconds, the man was on the ground with his hands behind his back, and Tom was calling for backup. Margaret moved quickly to the second fake server, the woman who had been questioning Mrs. Davidson about her jewelry and security system. Margaret told her that there was a problem with the kitchen equipment, and she needed help immediately. When the woman followed her into the kitchen, 2 real catering staff members were waiting to help detain her. The third and fourth fake servers were harder to isolate because they were in areas with more guests. Margaret had to be creative. She triggered the fire alarm system for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough to create confusion and get people moving around. In the chaos, she was able to guide the remaining fake servers away from the guests and into the hands of security personnel. At exactly 11:15 p.m., police sirens began wailing throughout Beverly Hills. Luis had coordinated the operation perfectly. Criminal teams were being arrested at houses across the neighborhood, caught in the act of breaking and entering. The fake servers at the party were also in custody, along with all their recording equipment and intelligence gathering devices. Robert was completely confused by what was happening. One minute he was hosting a successful charity gala, and the next minute his house was full of police officers and his guests were being questioned as witnesses. He found Margaret in his study, calmly, answering questions from Detective Morales. "Margaret, what's going on?" Robert asked. "The police are telling me that my catering staff were criminals and that you somehow figured it all out. How did you know what to look for?" Margaret looked at Robert with the same calm expression she had maintained for 3 years. But now, there was something different in her eyes, a confidence and authority that he had never seen before. "Robert, I need to tell you something about myself that I probably should have mentioned when I first applied for this job," Margaret said quietly. "My name is Margaret Chen, and I was a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department for 15 years before I came to work for you." Robert's mouth fell open. His quiet, unassuming housekeeper was a retired police detective? That explained so much about her behavior over the years, her awareness of security, her ability to stay calm under pressure, her incredible attention to detail. "I retired after I was shot during a robbery investigation," Margaret continued. "I wanted a quiet life, away from crime and violence. I thought cleaning houses would be peaceful. But tonight, I realized that I couldn't just stand by and watch innocent people become victims when I had the skills to stop it." Detective Morales smiled as he listened to Margaret's explanation. "She's being modest," he told Robert. Margaret was one of the best detectives we ever had. She solved more difficult cases than anyone else in the department. We tried for years to convince her to come back. The story of Margaret's heroic actions spread quickly through the local news media and then across the country. The criminal organization she had uncovered was responsible for more than $50 million in thefts across 3 states. They had been operating for almost 2 years, using fake catering staff to infiltrate wealthy homes and gather intelligence for coordinated robberies. Robert held a press conference 3 days later to publicly thank Margaret for her incredible bravery and skill. But the biggest surprise came when Margaret stepped up to the microphone to make her own announcement. "This experience has reminded me of something I had forgotten," she said to the crowd of reporters and cameras. "I became a police officer because I wanted to protect people and stop criminals from hurting innocent families. For 3 years I've been running away from that calling, but not anymore." Margaret announced that she was returning to law enforcement as a special consultant working with police departments to investigate crimes against wealthy individuals and families. Her unique experience as both a detective and a household employee gave her insights that no one else could provide. Robert was sad to lose the best housekeeper he had ever had, but he was proud to know that Margaret would be using her extraordinary talents to help protect other families from becoming victims. Margaret's story became an inspiration to people around the world. It showed that heroes can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most ordinary-seeming people are capable of the most extraordinary things. Her calm composure during those critical hours at the party had prevented multiple families from losing their most precious possessions and feeling violated in their own homes. Most importantly, Margaret's story proved that it's never too late to return to your true calling, especially when that calling involves protecting others and making the world a safer place.